Hey, you guys, and welcome back to the Beginner's Garden podcast. And for those of you listening on YouTube, thank you so much for watching today. In last week's episode, we talked about which cool season crops that I would not recommend beginners start from seed indoors. Today, we're going to talk about warm season crops. If you haven't caught last week's episode, I would recommend that you listen to that one because I give you a little bit more background on the why behind this entire conversation. If you did tune in, you probably noticed a theme in why I recommend beginners not start these seeds indoors and instead direct sow or plant the seeds directly in the garden. The main reasons were either the plant doesn't like to be disturbed and its roots don't like being transplanted. Number two, grow room space. That's a big thing I don't think people realize is needing grow room space and grow light space. So even if a crop can be indoors sown ahead of time, is it the crop that you want to allocate that precious grow light space to? And a lot of times that goes hand in hand with how many of a particular plant that you need to plant to begin with. It's different planting one tomato seed versus one bean seed and what you get as a yield. So we'll talk about that more obviously today when we're talking about warm season crops. And then we also talked about how it's easier to direct sow in many cases. So even though you can start something from seed indoors, a lot of times it's easier to direct sow. So why go through the trouble of indoor seed starting in the first place? That's what we talked about last week. I didn't specifically go through those three things in the episode, but you were able to hear them, that was a theme throughout. And you'll see this same theme today as we move into warm season crops. Now, again, if you're a beginning gardener and you don't yet know the difference between cool season crops versus warm season crops, we'll be talking about that in a future episode in future weeks. So just make sure you're subscribed. But you can also get a little bit of an idea just by listening to these episodes and taking note about what I'm listing and also some of the attributes of these plants that we're talking about. Before we go any further, I wanted to make sure that you know that I am offering the Before You Sow mini course. It's normally a $39 mini course on teaching you which seeds to start indoors, which seeds to direct sow, which ones you might want to buy as transplants from the garden center. And I also go into how to direct sow successfully. And this may be something that you are more interested in because if I'm telling you not to start these seeds indoors, you may wonder, like a lot of beginners wonder, okay, then how do I do this? Like, how do I plant these seeds in the soil and they actually sprout? How do I know when the soil is ready for them? I go through all that in a particular lesson in Before You Sow. Now, this is a $39 course through January 23rd, which is today. You can get it for free. We'll put the coupon code in the description. But if you're watching this later, after January 23rd, you can also get the Before You Sow as part of a Quick Start Garden Toolkit, which is actually only $19, and we will share that in the description as well. But I wanted to make sure you know about this because this is probably my most popular mini course, just because, especially for beginners, it helps people understand how to do these things, how to make sure that you're successful, especially when it comes to your seeds. So let's move on to the warm season crops that I don't recommend beginners especially start from seed. And if you do want to start them from seed, as in I start many of these from seed actually indoors, I will give you some tips on how to do it successfully. Crop number one we're going to talk about is cucumbers. The reason I chose cucumbers is because as a first-time gardener, I started cucumbers from seed indoors. I was so excited about them. They grew fast. They were beautiful. I started them without a grow light, but that's beside the point. But then when I transplanted them out into the garden, they died. And I've tried it before, or I've tried it since then, but then eventually I gave up, and I've seen a lot of people do this as well with about as little of success as I have. Now, as a gardener with 10 plus years of experience, I understand why that didn't work out well, and I'll explain to you why I think if you're a beginning gardener, then you shouldn't start cucumbers indoors without understanding these things. I don't think you should start them indoors anyway. I'll just tell you that if you're a first-time gardener, I think you need to put the seed directly in the ground, and I'll explain why. But if you do want to do this, I'm going to give you some tips to hopefully make them a little bit more successful than I have had. Cucumbers, in my experience, have a few problems when it comes to starting seeds indoors. Number one, the roots don't like to be disturbed. This is a common thing that you'll hear me talk about, but they really don't like to be transplanted into another location. They have a harder time acclimating to the soil. That's not the case with all crops, but I found it's definitely the case with cucumbers. Another problem is beginners especially don't realize how fast cucumbers grow once they sprout. The seeds sprout and they grow fast. The root system develops quickly. The sprouts begin, and then they have these large cotyledons, which is the seed leaves, and they start nourishing that plant. And then you get the true leaves, and they start growing fast. They grow much faster than your other crops like tomatoes or peppers for sure. And so what happens is that beginners, not knowing any different, they'll start all their seeds at the same time. They'll start their tomatoes and their peppers and their cucumbers at the same time, not realizing that those cucumbers are going to be ready to go into the garden way sooner than the tomatoes and peppers are. And often the environment is not ready for them. It is too cold. Cucumbers are specifically vulnerable to cold and cold snaps. And I think this is one of the big reasons why I didn't have good success. I've actually done this once as a first-time gardener, and now that I think about it, I think I did cucumbers just a few years ago, actually, as a pretty veteran gardener. But I planted them so early that when we had a cold snap, even if it wasn't a frost, but it was just too cold for them to like, they didn't make it. On the other hand, if you wait and sow the seed directly in the garden, once the soil has warmed up, that's the key. You have to have proper soil temperature. The soil has to be, I usually say personally about 65 to 70, the warmer the better. But once the soil has warmed up, these plants are going to grow faster and they're going to be stronger than if you transplanted them. That's something that's unique about many of the plants in this plant family, the cucurbit family, is that often when they get transplanted, even if they survive the transplant, they struggle to get acclimated. They have a stunted growth. And so if you were to direct sow that seed at the right time, you will probably get a plant that's about the same size initially, but then it becomes stronger. So ultimately, you're going to get a healthier plant if you get them direct sown and they're happy and it's warm. And that's a thing too that brings us into my next point, is that cucumbers are a warm weather crop and they also do pretty well in the heat. And so with that in mind, there's really no rush to get them in the garden. By contrast, let's take tomatoes, for instance. In my Arkansas climate, we have really hot summers. Tomato blossoms have trouble pollinating whenever the temperatures get too high. So for me, I kind of am in a short time frame to get tomatoes in the ground and being able to get them past the flowering stage before the heat sets in. Otherwise, if I wait too long, then they're not going to produce, and hopefully I can keep them alive till the fall and then they'll start producing again. But all that to say, I'm kind of in a rush for tomatoes. Cucumbers are not that way. For the most part, we're not in a rush to get cucumbers because they will do okay in the heat. So we're not under the gun as far as a time crunch there, but they really do like the warm weather. So the only rush we really get into is we want cucumbers sooner, right? And that's just a matter of us being patient. That's why I recommend that you sow your seed directly in the soil and don't worry about starting indoors. Now, again, I don't start them indoors anymore. Last year I did start them in my greenhouse, but I planted them directly in a grow bag and they did fine. And to me, that really doesn't apply. I'm talking about starting them in a cell tray or soil block or however you want to grow, and then with the purpose of transplanting out. If you were to do that, I would recommend that you do these things. Number one, don't start too early. I would say to start about 3 weeks before you intend to plant out in the garden. And I would recommend that you plan on not planting those cucumber transplants out into the garden for about 2 weeks after your last frost. And I'm not even saying your average last frost date necessarily, but like after your last frost, wait a couple of weeks because you want the weather to be stable You want the soil to be warm. That's another thing. You don't want to transplant a perfectly lukewarm or room temperature transplanted soil into cold soil. I mean, are the roots really going to want to extend into that if it's too cold for them? So don't start too early. I would say, again, about 3 weeks before you actually intend to plant out. And then you want to make sure that the weather is stable and the soil is stable if you do plant them out. Another thing I would recommend is to plant them in a larger cell tray or a soil block. I would personally plant these in the Epic cell trays that are the 4 cell. So they're the larger ones. They're not the 6 cell, because they grow so fast, they're going to need that root space. I did try last year, which you may have seen a YouTube video on this. You can check that out. I tried last year to skip a step with celery, and I planted celery in those Epic 4 cell trays, and it didn't do very well because celery is a super slow grower. I needed to start them in smaller trays because they grow so slow and it's hard to keep the moisture regulated. But with a fast growing crop like cucumbers and others that we're going to talk about, it's important to make sure they have enough room. So I would go ahead and start them in a larger cell tray. And like I said, I started my seeds in grow bags last year and they did just fine in that huge one. So I don't even know necessarily if you could really start them in something too big, but I would definitely make sure to start them in something where they would have plenty of room for growth. Also, if you start them in something like an Epic 4 cell tray or just a larger cell pack, be ready to pot them up if needed. If you start seeing the roots get to the edge of that cell, or if you do a soil block and you see the roots get to the edge, I would be ready to pot them up maybe in a 5-inch container, something like this if you're watching on YouTube, just to make sure they have plenty of room for root growth. So number 1, I would recommend, though, still, if you're a beginner, wait and directly sow those seeds in the garden. Number 2, the second plant that I recommend that you direct sow in the garden is squash and zucchini. Now, the whys here are going to be very similar to cucumbers, although there are some differences. They're similar to cucumbers in that the plants do not like being root bound. They don't like having their roots squished into a small space. They also are similar to cucumbers because they will outgrow their cell fast. And so again, the biggest mistake that I see beginners make when they start squash seeds indoors is that they start too early. They do not need to be started early because they grow so fast. And then again, like cucumbers, a stressed plant is not going to rebound well when planted. So if you planted too early and you've left your squash or zucchini plants in whatever tray you planted in, or maybe you even potted up, but they're still growing in there because you're waiting for the weather to be conducive to plant out, and they're getting root bound, they're getting stressed, they're not going to rebound as well. They are very picky when it comes to that kind of thing. And you'll notice that throughout the season, they're just not going to produce as well if they experience that early stress. And again, once the soil is warmed up, just like cucumbers, they are going to grow fast and strong, especially if you plant them in the ground. So I recommend as a beginner that you wait until the soil warms up and you plant the seed directly in the garden. But this is a plant that I actually start indoors for the first planting. And I'm going to explain why, and I'm also going to tell you how I do it in case you want to. But overall, I don't find this to be necessary. And as a beginner, just make sure that you listen to all of these things, or otherwise direct sow. And then if you need to come back to it later, you can. I start my squash and zucchini seeds indoors for the spring planting early because we deal with squash bugs and squash vine borer. And squash bugs are a nuisance, don't get me wrong, but squash vine borer is the death knell to the squash plant. And I have observed my climate enough. I'm in Arkansas in the River Valley area. We're newly zone 8A, but I've observed in my garden that the squash vine borer moth shows up around mid-June, and my plants are dead by the beginning of July. That is like clockwork. That's the way it's been for the last several years. And so knowing, I stopped trying to fight it. The squash vine borer is really hard to prevent, and it's really hard to get out of the plant once it's infested. I've given up on that. To me, it's too much trouble. For me, for the success for my squash plants, I start really early indoor seed starting, which I'm going to explain what I do. And then I plant multiple sowings. So I'll plant 3 sowings in a season in order to get squash rather than have to battle the squash vine borer and also squash bugs. So this is why I do it, because that first planting, I want to get in the ground as quickly as possible. When the soil warms up, I want to get a healthy transplant in the ground rather than direct sowing the seed. And that has been able to buy me a couple of weeks of harvest before the squash vine borer kills it. And to me, a couple of weeks of harvest is worth it for sure. But again, like I said with planting cucumbers, the key is not to start too early. I would recommend about 2 to 3 weeks before you plan to plant out. And for squash, I found that it's a little less sensitive to cold than cucumbers. So I usually start them about 2 to 3 weeks before my average last frost date. And then I plant them out when I feel like the last frost has passed. I will say a light frost covering them, they usually do fine. Cucumbers, not so much. That's just my experience. So that's why I don't feel like I have to wait too long with squash and zucchini like I would with cucumbers. But the point still is to don't start too early. I plan about 2 to 3 weeks before my average last frost date. Another recommendation is to use either soil blocks or a cell tray that offers air pruning, like the Epic cell trays that I mentioned in a previous podcast. I would recommend that because these plants don't like their roots disturbed. So if you can plant in a soil block or you can plant in a cell tray that offers that air pruning, that root pruning, then you're not going to have to worry about circling roots, and you're not going to have to worry about the roots getting, the plant getting too root bound. The whole goal in this process is for the plant to be transplanted before it ever has a chance to even know that it wasn't in its original space to begin with, if that makes sense. So what I have to do every year is I start either in a soil block or I start in the Epic 4 cell trays. I've done both and both have been, very successful. But then as soon as I start seeing those roots either come to the edge of the soil block or come to the edges of the Epic cell trays, I transplant them into a larger container, usually about a 5-inch container. I'm really bad at estimating, but I think that's what they are, and they're round. And I transplant those into that larger container. Again, the point is I don't want the plant to know that it's being restricted. I want it to go directly from that first place to the larger container. And then I leave it there until it's ready to go in the garden. Now, I have a whole YouTube video where I show how I do this. The key, though, is that once it's in that larger container, it still is not where you can just sit and hang out until the weather's ready for it necessarily. Ideally, the timing works out well, but it's not like tomatoes. It's not like peppers where they can kind of just hang in there a little bit longer. With squash, if it gets root bound at any point, it could yield being stunted altogether. I remember listening to a podcast, and there was a horticulturist that talked about how when you're transplanting squash, the key is to get it in the ground before there are more than 3 true leaves. I think she said 3. Now, the first leaves that come out, those are cotyledons. Those are seed leaves. Those don't count. I'm talking about the true leaves that are actually the leaf shape of a squash or a zucchini. And these days, especially once I get them in that pot, and obviously I can't see the roots at that point because they're not the Epic cell trays or they're not soil blocks, so I can't really see where the roots are. At that point is when I start counting the leaves, and I start trying to make sure that I get that plant out in the garden before that 4th leaf starts to appear. And by doing this, and I've done this the last few years, I've had the best squash harvest I've ever had. And I think the key was that from the very beginning, from the sowing in that first cell tray to the potting up to the getting out in the garden, my whole goal is get it transplanted before the roots have any idea what hit them. Literally, I guess, pun intended. But to make sure that they are just smoothly going from container to container to soil without feeling restricted. That's really the goal for me. Now, I mentioned that I do this for the first planting. That's just because I want to get a head start. If I were to direct sow those seeds, they wouldn't sprout because the soil is too cold during that time of the year when I start. Even at the end of, middle of March or so, when I would start my seeds, because our average last frost date is between April 1st and April 8th, then the soil would still be too cold in my climate. They wouldn't sprout. But For future successions, I direct sow. I don't see any point to have to mess with indoor seed starting at that point. So the second and third succession, I'll plant the seed directly in the garden. So that gives you an idea, if you want to start squash and zucchini indoors, how to do it. But I will also call your attention to grow light space, because these crops do grow rapidly. And even in that larger pot, they're going to be a pretty decent size plant. They're probably going to be 6-8 inches across. Do you have that amount of grow light space? Now for me, I've been using my greenhouse at this point because I can put them in the greenhouse. They can get plenty of light. I don't have to use my grow light space for these once they get that large. I'll use it when they're little, but then I'll put them in the greenhouse. Now, if you don't have a greenhouse, another option for you is once you pot them up, once they get too big and you don't have grow light space, take them outside during the day, bring them inside at night until the weather is stable. That's a workaround that you can use. But still, if you're a brand new gardener, I still think it's best if you can just wait, because unless you live where I live, number one, if you're trying to beat the squash vine borer, you don't know what the life cycle is. I've heard from other gardeners that say it doesn't show up, or it shows up too early. And so they actually have better success with later plantings. So that's just what works best with my climate. So if you're a brand new gardener, unless you talk to people who are local, you're not really sure what that life cycle is. And if you live on the West Coast, I guess you don't have to worry about the borer anyway. So it's really not a big deal, and you wouldn't probably be in any hurry to get yours in the ground anyway. Okay, so that's a lot on squash and zucchini. Let's move on to number 3, and this is beans. Now, beans are not actually hard to start indoors, but here is why I recommend that you direct sow them in the garden. The main reason is that you'll need more plants to get a decent harvest than you likely have the grow room space to support them. So if you're growing tomatoes, if you're growing peppers, beans are going to be grown in the same amount of time, or the same period of time, because they're still warm weather crops, and you're going to have a limited amount of grow light space. If you grow, let's say 20 bean plants. Let's say you have 20 bush bean plants because you just want to eat them fresh, or maybe you have 40 or more if you want to can them. Think about how much space that they are going to require under a grow light, even if it's 20. If you're sowing your bean seeds in a small cell, that's not going to last very long. I mean, yes, you may have grow light space for that, but beans, like the other ones, they are rapid growers, and they'll get those little seed leaves first. But then once they start getting their true leaves, those true leaves are large. It'll take up a lot of grow room space. And I really think in general, those small cell trays wouldn't cut it. I would do something like an epic cell tray that maybe 2 inch by 2 inch, something like that for beans, because like the other ones we talked about, they grow fast. Their roots are going to expand quickly. And I don't think the small trays you're not going to last very long. You're going to have to pot up pretty quickly anyway. So because of all that, it's easier to direct sow when the soil is warm enough. That's what I would recommend, that you just direct sow, just because of the grow light space. And then obviously too, if you're planting a lot of plants, if you're planting a lot because you want to can, think about how you're going to have to transplant all of them. Now, personally, I have never transplanted bean plants before. I've seen people do them, so I know it can be done, but I don't really have any personal experience on whether they transplant well or not. But think about how many of these you're going to have to physically labor to transplant. It's just so much easier to direct sow and let them grow where they're at. Now, if you do want to start bean seeds indoors for whatever reason, maybe you want to get a head start for some reason, or maybe your soil's too cold and you want to get them in the ground quicker. Here are some recommendations that I would make for you. As I mentioned before, start them in a larger cell tray, like the Epic 4 cell tray, I would say would be a minimum. Last year, I actually did a little experiment. My daughter's class at school, she was in 6th grade last year, they invited me to come and teach on something gardening. So as one of the demonstrations that I did, I planted some bush bean seeds in little cups, and they were probably 2 to 3 inch cups. They're like punch cups, party cups. And I planted like 2 every day for 2 weeks. I was showing the kids the different stages of bean growth. That's a really neat experiment. The kids loved it. They liked seeing how the different stages differ. But I had maybe 18 of those little cups, and they did really well in that cup. So even those were like 3 to 4 inches wide, and they did fine. So that would be not a bad way to start. And then you wouldn't have to pot up, because you could probably just go straight from that into the garden. But it took my entire 10 by 20 grow light to support them again. So think about your grow light space to be able to do something like that. Again, maybe you have found a reason that you like planting bean seeds indoors, like I realized with squash. And if so, I would love for you to let me know about that. All right, moving on to number 4. Number 4 crop that I would recommend that you direct sow in the garden is corn. Now, the why is going to be very similar to beans. You need a lot more than you probably have the grow lights to support. Now, the difference between corn and beans is that the corn plant is not going to grow as tall or as wide. It's not going to have as wide of a footprint as beans do, so you can get more under a grow light. But you need more corn than you realize. Experts say that you need at least 4 blocks of four rows of 4 corn plants to be able to have proper pollination. I would say that's the bare minimum, and I wouldn't even grow that. I would grow more than that. I've grown a 4x8 raised bed with it, and the pollination was kind of spotty. So you really need more corn than you realize to get full pollination. So you're looking at, again, a lot of grow light space if you're doing them indoors. I did try doing this a couple of years ago, and I think I actually didn't put them under grow lights. I think I started them later, and I just kept them in my greenhouse. And the purpose, though, was because a part of the garden that I wanted to plant them in, it tends to be very wet in the early part of the spring, and I knew that the seeds wouldn't germinate because the soil was too wet. That's something I talk about in Before You Sow. So I started them indoors, like in a seed tray, a 10-20 seed tray in my greenhouse, and then I transplanted them. But what I learned is that corn, in that experience, now I've just done it once, but in that experience, I found that corn was specifically sensitive to transplant shock. As I was starting to pull out these plants from this cell tray, and granted, the cells were small. In hindsight, I probably would have done a larger cell tray. But they developed these long roots, and I'm like, oh man, these roots are so big. I'm not sure how these are going to acclimate once I plant them. And they really didn't. They didn't acclimate well. So partly, I think I waited too long to transplant because they were just stressed. But I didn't, and then I also didn't grow them in a large enough container. But to me, it just wasn't worth it. It was a lot of work for like no reward, pretty much. But again, there were a lot of things that kind of went wrong. That was one of those experiments that I did, and I learned from my experience. But at the end of the day, I was like, this was not worth it when I can just direct sow corn, and it's always worked out fine. But if for some reason you do want to direct sow corn, and there could be reasons. I'm not really sure what reason they would be, but if you know, you can put them in the comments, because I'm sure it's something I haven't thought of. But if you don't have a greenhouse, make sure, like I did, make sure you have enough grow light space. And I would recommend that you choose a planter with a deep enough cell to accommodate the root growth, because there is kind of a taproot that develops with the corn. Mine were really small. They were like 1 inch. They were like plug trays. They were really small. I would definitely go larger next time. And then I would also recommend maybe find people online who do it successfully, or someone local that does it successfully, and learn their methods, because like I said, my one experience was a disaster, and I'm not one that can teach you how to do that. I didn't have a good experience, and I haven't found a reason to need to do it. But there are people who do it online. I have seen them, and just really study their methods, study how they do it and how they do it successfully, if this is something that you really want to do. But overall, to me, it's just so much easier to directly sow corn in the garden. Number 5 is okra. Okra is a staple here in the South, and here's why I recommend that you direct sow okra. First of all, it's easy to sprout. It easily sprouts in warm soil. You do have to wait until the soil warms out pretty consistently. I would say 75 maybe. Normally, I don't test the soil at that point, the soil temperature, but it's normally about 3 to 4 weeks after my last frost has passed. That's when I sow my okra seeds. One other reason why I think it's good to direct sow is because okra does develop a taproot. And if you think about the plant, it makes sense because it grows in the heat of the summer when there's often drought. So it's going to need that taproot to dig down and to get moisture. I've never really had okra suffer with drought in general, and I think that's part of it. But it starts developing that taproot that it's going to need to develop pretty quickly. So directly sowing makes sure that taproot doesn't hit anything, and then it continues growing where it needs to. And in general, unless you live in an extremely short growing season, there's really no rush. Because if you look at okra, the days to maturity, it's about 55 to 60 days, almost all the varieties that I've looked at. Now, those 55 to 60 days, let's say 2 months, it loves being in the 80s and above. Like 100-degree weather, okra can sail right through it. And it will rapidly grow in that warm weather. So if you live in an area with a really short growing season, this may be a reason why you might want to start okra indoors. But if you have a good 2 months of 80-degree plus, then okra should do fine without you having to worry about indoor seed starting. Now, if you do have a short season and you want to grow okra, maybe you don't have 2 solid months of 80-degree weather and you want to give it a little bit of a jump start, I would recommend that you plant them out when they're young so that the taproot doesn't develop too much. My very first season gardening, I went and bought okra transplants from the garden center. I don't even remember why, but they transplanted just fine, but they were young. They didn't have they were maybe 6 inches tall. So I would recommend that you get them in the ground as soon as you can, just so that they can develop that taproot in place. So that's really my only suggestion there, just because that's the only experience I have. It worked well, but I was also a beginning gardener and didn't know enough to really know what worked, what didn't, but it did ended up working well. Those are the 5 that I wanted to share with you today, but I will bring up a 6th one just because I used to suggest that you only plant these direct sow, but I have started starting them indoors pretty much every season, and I'm going to explain why. And that is watermelon and cantaloupe. Now, watermelon and cantaloupe, I always used to recommend that you direct sow just because they're like other members of the cucurbit family, like squash and cucumbers. They sprout fast in warm soil, they grow rapidly, and then also at that time you have your grow light spaces at a premium. So do you really want to use your grow light space for watermelon and cantaloupe versus tomatoes and peppers, understanding that watermelon and cantaloupe are like squash in that they grow rapidly and they'll need a larger pot. So mine usually go into that 5-inch pot eventually. So overall, if you wait to directly sow them in the garden, they're going to sprout. If you wait until the soil warms up, 65, 70, 75 would be even better, then they're going to grow fast and they're going to grow well. But why might you want to start them indoors? Well, for me, even though we have a really long growing season, who could say no to early melons, right? I started realizing that when I was direct seeding all of my melons, sometimes I wouldn't get them until September. And I don't know about you, but I want my favorite food, watermelon, in July, like everybody else, right? I want those earlier in the season. So that's why I start my melons indoors, is because I want my melons earlier. I want them in the heat of the summer. By the time September gets here, I'm kind of over it. You kind of wish for fall. I want those melons in the middle of the summer. That's why I start my melon seeds indoors, is just to be able to get a jump start and get a harvest faster. Now, we'll say that the process of indoor seed starting your melons is going to be the same as squash. I use the exact same method, but I will say that it does take to potting up and it does take to transplanting better than squash and cucumbers. With the melons, I don't have to count the leaves. I just put them in the soil when they're ready and they're usually good. So they're definitely easier to be able to transplant and take off than the squash and the zucchini. But that would be the last one, because often beginners are encouraged just to plant the seeds in the soil. And I would agree. If you don't want to mess with seed starting, plant them in the soil. You'll do great. You might choose a variety that has a shorter days to maturity. What I've noticed with the watermelon is if you get one of those huge watermelons, it's going to take longer. That's the one I harvested in September, was like a 30-pound watermelon. And everybody wants a 30-pound watermelon. But maybe if you want one earlier, then you might plant something like a sugar baby that's going to be a smaller one, because the smaller ones logically are going to harvest earlier. So that's another kind of workaround to get an early melon harvest without having to indoor seed start. I hope you enjoy this episode. Those are the 5 crops that I recommend beginners to directly sow in the garden. And just a reminder, if you're interested in more information on how to direct sow and do it successfully, you'll find that lesson inside my mini course, Before You Sow. We'll have all the details in the description. What would you add? Are there any that you start indoors that you found are not worth it? Are there different tips and tricks maybe that I didn't mention that you could share with us? Post those in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Beginner's Garden Podcast. And don't forget, you can always listen on the go. Just search for the Beginner's Garden Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I will chat with you again next week.